What's the good word, Josh? Your boy DKB here. So today I'm chatting with you guys about 5 players who'll be interesting. I think we should put extra eyes on them. These are obviously, for the most part, going to be some bottom tier roster guys that'll be fighting for some key positions if those positions even become available. So, you know, with Hard Knocks coming in and some extra tape or at least an extra perspective being provided, this should be very interesting when it finally comes down to the cuts and seeing where and how Robert Saleh ultimately decided to craft this roster. So let's go ahead and dive into number 1. We're going to be talking about wide receiver Irvin Charles, our undrafted free agent. Now, I think he'll be particularly interesting because he's already been with us for a little bit, so he at least has exposure to the West Coast offense, and he's been able to put in some pretty solid work early on, hence him being called out by Aaron Rodgers as having a good OTA and being one of the hardest workers that he's been able to see. And keep in mind, is huge, and he wasn't one of the only undrafted free agents that get called out, by the way, but it's huge because you don't really expect, in my mind, a guy like Aaron Rodgers, who's primarily working with guys who are going to be starting, to be that involved and notice that much about these guys. So obviously, he brings some pretty solid size, right? One of the bigger wide receivers that we have in our room. He's going to have that experience. The transition to working under this new coaching staff should help him out quite a bit. And he was the guy that a lot of us looked at as a potential Denzel Mims replacement. Anyways, before we started hearing some of these new names like Cap and Brownlee that were coming out that also have some decent size to them, but he does have a few other things working for him. He had a solid preseason in 2022. He has special teams ability as a punt gunner, and really this will come down to, will the New York Jets keep 6 wide receivers or not? You can make the case either way. We kind of chatted about this on the Jets Flight Squad podcast, but, you know, there's going to have to be cuts somewhere. Maybe you opt to try to build your practice squad up and call a guy up as you need when injuries hit in order to give you an extra lineman, either offensive or defensive. Maybe you want to have that for safety. So we'll see what pans out there. But for a guy that's been able to show some strong hands, good red zone presence, and again, we've kind of seen what he was able to do in the preseason. Having that Aaron Rodgers backing also helps quite a bit. Maybe he can find a way to make a case for himself to finally make this roster and replace a guy like Denzel Mims. If not, then he'll probably get another quality year on the practice squad with us, which isn't necessarily the worst thing either, as we'll probably be looking at another revamped wide receiver room in some capacity. But let's go into number 2, tight end EJ Jenkins. Now, the tight end room is particularly interesting because we have a lot of bodies there. Ideally, we're going to end up keeping 4 tight ends with the way that Nathaniel Hackett likes to utilize his people. Everybody's going to see the field in some capacity, whether it's special teams or actually being able to get out there in a lot of those 2 packages. Potentially 3 tight end packages, maybe once we get within the 40-yard range to kind of utilize a lot of those different skill sets and get that experience. But EJ Jenkins is interesting because he's going to be competing against Kenny Yeboah, Zach Kuntz, and then Isaiah Gavings, who is another guy that could be a mystery player that ends up making this roster as well. A lot of similar-ish skill sets there for that final position, so special teams ability is going to be at a premium here for whoever can lock down that supposed 4th spot. But with a guy like EJ Jenkins, you're talking about a utilized heavily as a wide receiver, converted to a tight end within his final season, I believe. And so you're talking about, physically already being able to see him being utilized down the seam, split out wide, where he was able to do a lot of damage towards the end of his collegiate career. And he's further along in this development than a lot of these other guys. You know, even Gavings, Isaiah Gavings, high upside guy. But if I had to put a bet on it right now, I would say EJ Jenkins would beat out Kenny Yeboah, Zach Kuntz, and Isaiah in a straight up battle when it comes to receiving ability. Arguably, all of these guys need some work in the blocking department, but you can easily see a pretty clear role for a guy like EJ Jenkins here if they chose him. Now, we'll see if politics come into play, trying to keep a guy like Zach Kuntz, especially if he doesn't show out maybe to the same degree as the EJ Jenkins, but nonetheless, he has the talent to do so in year one for this unit. Now, going into our third position, I'm reaching deep here in the linebacker unit because I feel like we've talked about everybody but this guy. But Chazz Surratt is a guy that's on the outside looking in that maybe can lock down a backup role if we end up keeping 5 guys. Now, a former day 2 pick in the 3rd round from the Vikings 2021 draft class, it lets you know what a lot of the NFL teams, or at least the Vikings specifically, thought about what he brings, especially considering Chazz is a guy that he converted from quarterback to linebacker late in his career after losing out to Sam Howell and just wanting to get on the field. So you're talking about a very fresh, very raw prospect, only having 2 years to essentially work on his position. So there wasn't going to be a lot of pure linebacker instincts there and stuff. But within that time of him transitioning, to let you know the ability that this guy showed and why he was so highly regarded, all he did was go out to earn the ACC Defensive Player of the Year and first team All-Conference in back-to-back seasons, at least for the first team All-Conference part, as soon as he made the conversion. So, he's a guy that shows up on the stat sheet pretty consistently, right? He hasn't been able to see the field as a linebacker yet, and when the Vikings changed coordinators, he just didn't fit the new system. But it was a smart pickup by Robert Saleh for a guy that fits the mold, smaller, undersized, doesn't have the best speeds, running a sub 4.6, but it definitely brings the ball of energy, definitely brings the high, immense upside that you like out of a guy like this. And you feel like with what he showed in college, if he can take to the coaching, then he's a guy that, is going to exceed even his original draft position, but definitely what he's been relegated to, which is practice squad and special teams for the most part. So no defensive reps, as I mentioned. He does bring the special teams ability. He could be an ace there for us, which having him in the 4th or 5th spot would definitely be huge there for us. I don't think he'd even be in consideration for that 3rd backup spot where nobody even really has that locked up. But you have a recent draft pick ahead of you. You have Jamie Sherwood, who people feel high of. And then, long-term wise, he's a guy that probably is going to see his best performances at the will linebacker role, where he can kind of react and chase, as opposed to necessarily having to process a lot of information, diagnose these plays. Keep in mind, again, he's a very raw prospect, so you don't want to put a ton on his plate. You want him to go out there and show a lot of that athleticism, a lot of that hard work and determination, and let him turn that into production. But he's a guy that I wouldn't mind seeing stick around on the practice squad again. Just continue to really hone his craft under a defensive, coaching staff that has already proven that they can turn guys around when you want to consider what Jamie Sherwood could be this season and what they did with a guy like Quincy Williams, continuing to keep C.J. Mosley's career on an uptick with him still gathering accolades and being a huge performer here. So I'm very excited to see if Chazz Surratt can make some noise once these pads come on and see if he's ready to kind of take another step after being able to sit for quite some time with this coaching staff. And then we have our 4th guy. I couldn't make all of them, guys that we haven't necessarily heard about, but Tony Adams here. Now, from his perspective, I think it's more so, what does the coaching staff favor? Is it going to be, the upside and we'll take the risk on seeing what the negatives of his game are? Or is it going to be the comfort of knowing you have a veteran in Adrian Amos, and even though he's not perfect, he's definitely not a one-for-one replacement with Chuck Clark. You'll take the experience over whatever inconsistent performances maybe you get with a guy like Tony Adams. But, there's a lot of versatility, a lot of different things you can use. Obviously, when they didn't keep Joyner, I think that was a huge plus that they thought Tony Adams could be the actual replacement for him within this defense. But then you also take a look at all the things Tony Adams could potentially do on the field. I do think he'll be a great free safety for us, but you can use him in 3 safety package options if you want to go out there and still utilize him as a free safety. He can go out there and potentially replace Michael Carter II coming out of the slot. And then you can even utilize him near the line of scrimmage. But I think you look at his athletic profile and his ability to kind of diagnose what's going on around him and react to it pretty well. I think you want to try to get him as many snaps in the free safety position as possible. So with him, we'll talk about it to death, but to be honest, I think he has a legit opportunity to outplay a guy like Adrian Amos, who isn't necessarily a lock to make this roster either. So we'll chat about that in another video. But Tony Adams is definitely a guy that I hope to hear is kind of balling out during training camp and can win a starting job. Prove this coaching staff right that it was a smart move to move on from Pinnock and entrust in Tony Adams here. And then our final guy, Zach Wilson. Again, couldn't make them all, but from a standpoint of trying to address some questions, right? This is a guy that should be able to hopefully blend into the background. It's going to be a lot harder with Hard Knocks around. They're definitely going to play up the Aaron Rodgers versus Zach Wilson connection, how things are looking, and definitely probably giving some insight into a lot of the personal mishaps we've seen last year in terms of leadership ability and maturity, right? Being able to work with his teammates, stuff like that. We've seen a lot of bad things like the Mike F. and White shirts that were being worn and, everybody kind of gravitating to every other quarterback but him. So there's definitely going to be some questions to address with him that we still would like answer, right? Can he string together some good practices? We had no idea until Garrett Wilson and others called out that Zach Wilson's accuracy was shoddy and all over the place during training camp, and we only got the highlighted practices where he was super effective in red zone drills, or he threw 7 straight completions, the only incomplete passes were a couple of drops by his receivers, different things like that. So can he string together some good practices? Can he build on his consistency? This is going to be a huge problem because we never knew what kind of quarterback we were going to get from week to week with a guy like Zach Wilson. The only short thing was we're going to have a low passing performance, and hopefully he was going to be able to avoid turnovers. But we'd like to see him, we don't need 300-yard days in practice or him throwing, 6 touchdowns every day. But you like the consistency there. Is he building on, the offense that's being installed? Are there certain routes that he's recognizing well? Is he manipulating the defense? It doesn't even have to be that complex, but you do want to hear that there isn't a steep fall off from day to day with, mountains and valleys going on with a guy like Zach Wilson, especially if we are truly going to entrust him to be our backup quarterback for this regular season. And then he's going to be working with the second string unit. So this is still a great opportunity with the star power and the depth that we've been able to build on the offense. So he's potentially looking at working with guys like Alan Lazard or Corey Davis, depending on who you figure is the true number 2, Randall Cobb, CJ Uzama, and Jeremy Ruckert, and then in the backfield, guys like Izzy Abanikanda and Michael Carter most likely, but you could argue Bam Knight just depending on how much work Breece Hall gets during the training camp. But those are my 5 guys. Let me know what you think about some of those storylines that are going to be involved in them, and if you guys have any underrated players that you feel that we should be paying attention to over training camp as well. And I'll catch you guys again. Peace.